Well, when you hear that music, you know what time it is. I'm Jim Reed, and it's time for another week of the Rec Poker Podcast Forums Edition. I'm so excited to be your host this week. You can find me at Bluffsterini in the home games and at Jim in the forums, and I'm just one of a few people that are very excited to be talking to you about poker strategy today. One of the other ones is Chris Jones. Chris, tell us a little bit about where we can reach you.
I'm Chris Jones. You can find me 5x5 on PokerStars and on Twitter. Yeah.
But surely there are other people here
And
whose names are alphabetically following Chris.
Yeah,
Like John Somsky, for instance.
I'm John Somsky. I'm Poker Geek MN everywhere.
I'm Rob Wash. I'm Rob Washam, and I'm Radman50 everywhere.
And I'm Taylor Moss. You can find me in the Rec Poker home game as Gopherboy TJM or on Twitter as Taylor_Moss.
The Running Aces Casino, which I have to get across here, one of our major sponsors, along with Learn Pro Poker and website AMP. You're welcome, Steve. So here we are for this episode of the Forums podcast. And, you know, hosting the podcast has its privilege every once in a while. And we're actually going to talk about one of my posts this week. That's right. It's at Jim posts in the rec.poker forum, home game betting pattern. So basically, this is from one of the home games we play each and every night on PokerStars for play money. And I was in the big blind, and a player, Milo Junk, was in the small blind. And I'll just go through the action and we can talk about it. We're basically going to be talking about whether we should be leading or checking some streets and the sizing of the bets that we choose to make. So basically, it folds around to the small blind. Milo Junk has 10 of diamonds, 7 of diamonds, and completes the small blind. I've got king of spades, 8 of diamonds, and I just check the big blind. And I'll go through all the action. We can talk about it afterwards. So the flop comes king of diamonds, 7 of hearts, jack of diamonds. So Milo Junk has bottom pair and a flush draw. They lead for half pair, and I call in the big blind with top pair, no kicker. The turn comes the 8 of clubs. So Milo picks up a little equity, ends up leading pot, and because I turned 2 pair, I just smooth call, and we can talk about whether I should have raised or not later. The river comes the queen of hearts, and Milo, I think, turns their pair into a bluff here and bets half pot, which I call behind and show down 2 pair kings and 8s, beating 1 pair of 7s to the 10. So there's some conversation in the forum about whether Milo Junk should be making that big turn bet when they gain a little draw equity. And so let's just talk about that a little bit. So at Jamel, at Patch Person, at Stringbender, and at 5x5, all lean in here and have something to say. Would anyone like to go first and talk about sort of what they might be thinking about, either in Milo Junk's position or in my position there? I know ranges are so wide when you get to this small blind completed, big blind check. That might affect some of our action.
One thing just to add, which I think is good for context, is we're at the 5,100 level, and you have about 3,200, so we're about 32 blinds effective.
Yeah, and just to recap the hand a little bit too, from Milo's perspective, they complete pre-flop, so it's shaping out to be a small, pot. They lead out quite large on the flop when they hit bottom pair. They have bottom pair plus a flush draw. They get called. Then on the turn with the 8 of clubs coming in, they add in a little bit extra equity because now they can hit a gut shot straight. They again choose to lead for a very large sizing. And then on the river, when the queen comes, they miss all their draws and are stuck with bottom pair. And that's when they make the half pot bet.
Yeah, so some people were talking about maybe on the flop, as played, it's a half pot lead. And I think Chris and Jerry, you both made the good point in the comments there that you can actually fold out the same kind of drawing hands with a smaller bet than half pot. Maybe half pot is too big for this kind of range versus range situation. Is that approximately correct?
In general, I like smaller bets on the flop. Especially in this situation, I liked a third bet, and then he did pick up a little bit of equity with the turn, but not a lot. And I probably would have checked the turn myself rather, because you had already showed interest in by calling on the flop, and I guess I would have check folded or check called the turn with his hand.
And I would even, I mean, I agree with all of that. I would even sometimes, I would consider it, I think a check raise is far more something I would consider on this turn than I would leading out for a pot size bet. I think we're not, once we get a flop call here, our opponent, you in the big blind, has a lot of kings. They have a lot of jacks. They have a lot of diamonds. We block a lot of those diamonds, but they still have some diamonds. They might have some kind of weird straight draws. But so I don't know that we're going to fold out much of that with a smaller bet on the flop. And I still don't know that once that 8 doesn't really change a lot on this board. The 10-9 gets there, but that's about it. That card really changes. And so I really would prefer probably a check to hope to sort of check it through. I think this turn checks through a lot if we check. But if it doesn't, if I check raise, I think I can get somebody off a jack or a king a lot more easily than I can. I think a jack or a king is just going to be calling me every time, and probably any better flush draw is going to be calling me as well. So I don't know what that large pot size bet is really accomplishing for me, other than maybe getting some of those weak straight draws to get out and lose some of their equity.
Yeah, because our opponent called the flop, and we're now in this spot where we're on the turn. Not really that scary of a card came in, and we're trying to gain some fold equity. And it looks like how we're trying to gain fold equity is by increasing our bet sizing, which isn't always the correct thing to do. Because our opponent showed willingness to play on the flop. We only had bottom pair. They were very passive pre-flop by just checking the big blind. But then when we, I'm assuming, let out for half pot on the flop, they just called. So we're essentially hoping that they have something like ace high, where they thought ace high might still be good, or some sort of draw that they're ready to give up on, like a queen 10 or something like that. Like those are very like specific hands that we're targeting, trying to get to fold. And if that's the case, we don't need to go to a full pot size to get some of those hands to fold. So it's like we're concerned about our opponent's hand, and the action that we took was to just increase our bet sizing to try and make it more likely that they were going to fold. And that's usually not the approach that you want to be taking.
Now, someone asked if in my position I'd consider raising the turn there with 2 pair, and I think because it's such a big bet, it's pretty polarized. It should be anyway. So I think raising would be a mistake, because you're only ever going to get called by hands that have you beat. So I think as played, that's the right play there. So what would you do if you were in this position with Milo Junk and you had 7-7? So you flopped a set on that flush draw board, and then that turn comes in. Are we in a position here where we're trying to play the flop and the turn the same way with 7-7 and with 10-7 of diamonds? Is that something that you guys would have be the case no matter what your hand was there?
If I flopped a set, I think I'm raising his betting.
Oh, sorry. I mean, if Milo had flopped the set, so it's his first action, because he's playing. I feel like he's basically playing his flush draw here. Like I almost feel like he's not really playing his pair for showdown value. I think he's mostly like essentially playing a semi bluff. That's the way when I saw the bet sizing, I thought this is a series of semi bluff bets that don't get there. And if that turn bet, if that diamond comes in on the river, then he's in a much better position. But when it doesn't, he's in this spot where he's like, okay, well, now my only way to win the hand is with a bluff. Because yeah, take it, Jerry.
I was just going to say, if he had flopped a set of sevens, I think that turn bet of his is too large because I'd want a value bet. I would want to be charging some made hand that you have and not be so much afraid of the flush draw at that point, just making sure I didn't give correct pot odds on my bet out on the turn for a call for a flush draw, but otherwise get some value rather than pushing you out of the pot.
Chris, you look like you want to jump in there.
I may still with a set there of set of sevens, I may still be checking with the intention of check raising.
Right.
I feel like this is a really I'm doing that in particular because we are pretty short stacked. We don't need a lot of bets to go into this to get stacks in, and so if I want to get stacks in, I pretty much can, with a little bit more aggression. And I feel like a check raise is going to accomplish that even more. Because like basically when you call that flop, if I bet like I can bet half pot there and then try to get stacks in on the river. And that's another potential approach, but I kind of like the check raise a little bit better. And if I need to, I can get that value on the river.
That's the only thing I think about is lose. If I'm in that spot in the big blind, a lot of times I'm going to, after you show that stab initially at the pot on the flop, I'm probably going to check back. And then I don't know if you get as much value in your hand by betting out the river. But.
Yeah, that was the exact point that I was going to bring up, is that our opponent really hasn't shown any sort of aggressive action. So banking on a check raise or trying to go for a check raise in this spot isn't like the typical plan of action as when you're in the small blind and you flop a set. Typically someone from, mid position, late position, early position, someone that's got position on you has taken some sort of aggressive action. Pre-flop, there was no aggressive actions here. So it's a little bit more likely that we just see that check behind. So I'm on board of, if I'm going to be betting here, I probably want to be betting half pot again, where I'm doing that with some top pair hands, some really strong hands like sets, and then some draws that I have, which potentially include diamonds or straight draws. I'm probably not going for a check raise here, just given how it all played out pre-flop.
I mean, that all makes sense to me too. But I do find these blind versus blind scenarios are the ones where I think that this is actually, one of the we've talked a long time ago about completing from the small blind, and one of the reasons I like doing that is because I think it opens up these opportunities, and I think people in big blind scenarios when it's blind versus blind and it's just been completed and there's been no sort of action taken and then there's a check to them, I think a lot of people see that as open license to, okay, this is my pot now. And I think people are willing to bet more in those scenarios than they are if this was any kind of open and call, an open and defend from the, if I had opened from the button, I would never do that. But with that blind versus blind scenario, I feel like you have more license to do this sometimes.
Especially the person that you're playing against is named Bluff Starina. Right?
Yeah, a good point. I mean, this is sort of an opponent model question, isn't it? I mean, the question is this opponent going to be the kind of foe who bluffs in position when you check the turn? I mean, I probably am in this case. I don't know if that's, sometimes I wonder a lot about these hands that we talk about, especially in the home games, where we do start to get some tells on people, or at least some sense of whether they're aggressive or passive players, and tailoring our game accordingly. But
I find, it's interesting. This is a good situation. For me, this is one of the more challenging things I find in poker is playing heads up when it's blind versus blind. You're in the small blind and it folds around. And it seems like taking two different tracks. A lot of times with lower buy-in tournaments or regs, low regs, you go for maybe a 3 or 3.5x raise, and you get a lot of fold equity with that. But it seems like with the higher buy-ins, or as you progress in a tournament, you kind of have to switch gears, and it does become a lot of limping. Like towards the end of later stages of the tournament, I probably limp 80% of those pots versus raising. But early on, I think there's a lot of fold out equity.
And Jerry, does that have anything to do with the stack sizes at the table at that point in the tournament, or is it more about the people that you're finding on your left in that spot, or both?
Both.
Yeah.
Both, because it funnels up, right? You have people get lucky as you get later stages of a tournament, but the quality of the play does go up. So that's a function of it, and everybody's playing on shorter stack sizes. So you're trying to preserve that.
So String Bender makes a comment in the forum post here. Says the flop bet's too big, 1/4 to 1/3's fine. Small blind has a pretty big equity advantage on the board against the big blind's very capped range, and that the turn should be checked 100%. Small blind picked up a little extra equity, which is precisely why they would not want to bet and get blown off that equity by a raise. So instead, the small blind should check call and let the big blind bluff with all their misdraws and floats. Then play poker on the river, my favorite expression, and either check fold or check call depending on the read of the big blind. And that raises another kind of interesting point here, which is like, what do you want to do with that equity that you pick up? Because in a sense, I think you're kind of defining your hand a little bit if you check call with that action. I mean, it all depends on how thoughtful are you being in constructing these ranges in advance. But I don't know. What do you guys think?
Well,
When I get some extra equity, I'm always inclined to add some fold equity to that. And part of it's just because I love shoving. And so I need to, well, I do. And so I need to have a good mix of, heavy value, thin value, and these high equity or higher equity than just bluff draws. But that's not everybody's game.
I
might be wrong. Yeah.
I don't think that this is the greatest example for picking up that equity, because you have a flush draw on the board. So, I mean, you're picking up, if your opponent is on a flush draw, you're only picking up 3 rather than 4 outs. I don't know how much equity you really do pick up on the turn. And then your question as far as when you get to the river, if it's you in the big blind or him in the small blind, if I'm in the small blind, or if I'm you in the big blind and then facing his half pot bet on the river, I mean, that's when you have to start, if you can. I have a lot of trouble doing this in game and in real time, but you try and figure out what his value hands are, what his potential bluff hands are, and look at that ratio and are you getting the correct pot odds to call? And if you're him, you're trying to get a bet sizing that would make you indifferent to that.
Right.
So,
Rob, did you want to jump in there?
well, I was just going to say the ranges that we're talking about here are so wide open. You've got a small blind just, completing, and then a big blind just checking. So, in a typical hand, you have somebody raising, then you have the big blind calling. You've got some basis of creating a distinct range that these people are on. So in a small blind situation like that, if I was Milo Junk, I would probably bet out, because anytime I connected with the flop, I feel I'm ahead of the big blind.
Sure. Yep.
Right? Because it's the ranges are so wide, it could be any 2 cards, literally any 2 cards. So I would bet out, and then I would just probably totally stop on the turn, because you called back. I've got whatever I've got right now. I've got a pair, so I'm gonna use that as a bluff catcher maybe, but I'm not gonna put another cent in the pot as soon as you call that first bet.
And all of this is sort of like one of the things that this hand brings up for me is I think this was mistake that I have hopefully corrected now, but I think I would always get so excited about pair and flush draw.
Yeah.
Like, oh my, let's get stacks in this, let's go. But I think like the more you kind of play these types of spots, you understand that not all pair and flush draws are the same and are of equal value. And there are some that are worth getting stacks in, and there are some that are worth like, let's see how this plays out. This is still have a lot of value, but I don't need to push that as far as it, just because I got that pair and flush draw. Um, there's reasons, and especially when you have the bottom pair and you've got a potentially a flush draw that's not gonna, that you can be out flushed as well. Those are the kinds of pair and flush draws that you may want to have that turn check back in your, or turn check in your sort of like in your arsenal.
Yeah, I like that. And so one question I have for us before we wrap up this post is, on the river, you're in Milo Junk's position, okay? So as played, you made that turn polarized bluff and you bricked the river. Do you ever have a bluffing range here? And what is the sizing of that bluff? Because I think the key that you guys have hit on here is my range, my continuing range with this action is pretty strong already. So certainly by the time I call the turn at pot, that's a pretty, I mean, I'm actually, my calling range might be stronger than my raising range there, because I'm basically saying I'm not going to add any fold equity to this hand. So is there a size that makes sense there? Is it a very narrow range? Should Milo Junk just never be bluffing there because they have the 7, or because I'm just too strong? Or what would go into your thought process as you're trying to play Milo's river there out of position?
The fact that he bet full pot on the turn and you called it, to me, would shut me right down. If he had made a normal size bet on the turn, maybe half pot to a little over, maybe, 70%, something like that, and you called that, now I could still put you on that, on a draw that you're still hoping comes in. So now I feel more inclined to be able to bluff you on the river. But if you're going to call a full pot size bet on the turn, I don't think you're doing that with the kinds of draws that I'm going to beat if I hit my draw and without a made hand. I think you've got a made hand at that time. So I think the way he did it, by having the pot size bet on the turn, I could not pull the trigger on a bluff on the river.
Yeah, I agree. I'm probably chickening out here. But if I wasn't and I was going for a bluff here, I would go with a large sizing, and I would probably go, excuse me, over pot sizing, given how it played out. Because if we go pot on the turn, and then this river comes in, which doesn't really change too much. All the flushes miss, like whatever was probably good on the turn is probably still good on the river. So if I have something like a set, or I turned the straight, or, one of those like types of strong hands, and my opponent has already shown the willingness to call a pot size bet, well, guess what? Now I'm ratcheting it up even more. I'm going, 1.5 pot. I don't know what effective stack size is here, but it might just be an all in here. So if I am bluffing, I probably want to keep up with that same sizing. So if I choose to bluff, it might be like an all in sizing here.
And I mean, I'll tell you, in real time, when the turn came and I turned 2 pair and saw the pot size bet, I remember thinking, boy, how would I proceed here if I had not turned that second pair? Because honestly, half pot, full pot, even being in position, I'm not like loving life at getting in there with top pair 8 kicker, even blind versus blind. One of the things about blind versus blind is there's so many of these 2 pair combos out there that you can't really track. As Rob's saying, you don't get to define the ranges as much. But I'll tell you, I mean, I was not convinced that I was going to be ahead 100% of the time there. So yeah, I don't know. It feels like, is there a different play they could have made on the turn? Like maybe a bigger bet on the turn if they know they're not going to be aggressive on bricks on the river? or a smaller one if they are considering it, or it's just a tricky spot. Poker's hard. Any
Well,
last thoughts there?
one of the things on this one, his bet on the turn would have folded out most one pair hands.
Yeah.
And the fact that you gained that two, you got all of a sudden you turn two pair. So all of a sudden you have a hand that actually can call that bet. So in norm, 70% of the time, that's not going to happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
70% of the time, he's gonna win the pot right there with that full pot bet. So the thing is though, because he didn't win it there, that's when you need to shut down on the river.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. That what it tells you about my continuing range
Exactly.
is that I'm not folding.
Yep.
Period. To a half size bet, Chris.
Right.
And that's why if we had checked this turn and it had checked through, I'm far more likely to think my 7 is still good on this river, and I am then going to be potentially check calling because then I'm going to put you on potentially some diamonds, some other kinds of things, some of the missed straight kind of hands. Those are the on that river I'm much more likely to maybe check call on a river, on this river. But that's still, I'm probably still just giving up. But then there's not as much chips in this pot. I don't think this hand deserves, from our 10-7 perspective, to have that many chips in the pot. And so like as we keep pushing this, and we do have the 10, which is kind of nice in terms of like some of the straight possibilities.
Yep.
So I can see maybe convincing myself a bluff is okay, but I would only want to really bluff on that river rather than on the turn.
Cool. All right. Well, any other thoughts before we wrap it up? All right. Thanks, guys. Well, I'd like to thank Jamel and Stringbender for their contribution into the post. I'd like to thank our sponsors, the one and only Running Aces, Learn Pro Poker, and Website Amp. Thank you to the panel, and we will see all y'all next Saturday. Thanks, folks.